Hello viewers, thank you for joining me. This is not a review. Every once in a while I'll watch something that I don't plan to make a full review for, but end up spending so much time thinking about that I can't resist making a video to discuss some aspect of it. Within the last year or so, I started going back and rewatching some of the kids' shows that I didn't pay as much attention to during my childhood, and the first 3 seasons of Yu-Gi-Oh! Fall into that category. I don't mean to ramble from the get-go, but I do want to start this off with a little of my personal background with this series, because this discussion is mostly going to revolve around the ways in which GX surprised me, and the character of Jaden Yuki in particular. That's as good a place to start as any, I suppose. I did watch these shows with their English dubs. It only felt right, as that's how I would have been exposed to them had I gotten into them as a child, so you will be hearing their English names here. As far as Yu-Gi-Oh! Goes as a franchise, GX is the only one of the first 3 seasons that I really didn't get into at all as a kid. Original Duel Monsters was something I came back to on and off throughout the years, and there was one summer when I got really into 5Ds, a love that slowly faded away as school started back up and I wasn't home to watch it anymore, but I actively avoided Season 2, and I can't even say I had a particularly good reason for it. Growing up, I would have said it was because the premise of Duel Academy was a dumb idea, or because Jaden was a really annoying character, but I'll admit it. I basically just latched on to the most popular reasons to hate GX, and knew practically nothing about the show firsthand. So I can tell you that I was pleasantly surprised, pretty much from the very beginning, when I went back and made an effort to watch this show with an open mind, and I think Jaden himself is what caught me most off guard. I was prepared to just tolerate him all the way through. Now I'm comfortable defending that he's not the awful character that everyone around me, at least, always made him out to be, and I think a lot of it has to do with context. Early on, as the new students are just getting settled in, GX's story is mostly about the school itself. Duel Academy is run along the same lines as the schools in Baka and Test or Assassination Classroom, where grades are valued above all else, and the students who get placed in the lowest scoring dorm, like Jaden, are treated like dirt. So enter our new hero. Jaden is almost unbearably cheerful and positive, loves dueling but couldn't care less about his grades or his schoolwork, and most importantly is completely unfazed by his teachers' and classmates' opinions of him. As the series first kicked off, before any of the serious end-of-the-world problems had been introduced, it was kind of satisfying just to see Jaden continue to succeed in spite of all the labels placed upon him, and end up empowering other students who'd been beaten down by the school's attitude in the process. A long time ago, I went back through the 2nd season of Digimon to try and resolve some lingering feelings I had in regards to whether Davis had really earned his spot as their leader, and I came to a similar conclusion here. In general, Jaden may not have been the best main protagonist ever written, but at this point in the story, he was the perfect hero for these particular circumstances, and that's something I can appreciate. Davis and Jaden actually had a lot in common at this point. Davis being such a simple, upbeat character is actually what defeats their final villain. Meanwhile, Jaden becomes decidedly less simple as the series goes on, but that's a long way off. In truth, the disparaging attitude towards the Slifer students isn't the focus for long, so that appreciation was a little hard to hold on to at times, but I think it did its job. He may not have been a very deep character most of the time, but Jaden never really got on my nerves the way I expected him to. His stubborn positivity had served a purpose long enough to soften out the edges there. And in general, I think all the characters in GX got off to a good start. I feel like Chazz was the one with the most potential for audience backlash as the new rival, and I also feel like he serves as a good example for one of the things GX did right. I'm sure that a lot of the animosity towards this season was because it was the first sequel. Much as people love to ridicule the premise of 5Ds, I do feel that fans had gotten used to the idea of there being other Yu-Gi-Ohs by the time it came out. GX didn't have that buffer, but it did have something else going for it. In the same way that Jaden and Yugi have very little in common past their main character charisma, I never got the impression that GX was trying to replace the original. It was committed to being its own thing. And Chazz's time as the school's top, arrogant, rich snob is very short-lived, actually. Losing to Jaden, who no one respects at this point, leads to his fall from grace very early on, and once he finds himself again, he comes back as this goofy, over-the-top, complete joke of a character that no one really takes seriously, but everyone embraces, and I loved that. Like, the writers knew that some sort of designated rival character needed to exist, but also that no one was going to replace Seto Kaiba. Chazz never really grew to be one of my favorite characters. As the series goes on, he's just constantly being pushed out of the spotlight by other characters who are either more interesting or just more important in that particular moment. But he has a presence all the way through, and I appreciated that they took the time to make him his own person. You know, this wasn't something I was going to bring up until I made my way back around to Jaden's character and how much he changes in the latter half of the series. But so long as I'm making a video just to ramble on about the Yu-Gi-Oh! GX characters and why they stood out to me, I might as well do a thorough job of it. There is one other big aspect of Chazz's character that I didn't mention. We already knew he came from a wealthy, influential family. We meet his two older brothers about halfway through Season 1, and are given a much clearer view of just how much pressure he's under to succeed. They belittle him almost constantly, reminding him how much he has to live up to. I didn't bring up their existence at first, because I thought it highlighted a discrepancy in the way he was characterized. In case you didn't know, the last 25 episodes weren't ever dubbed, so I am at least a little familiar with the Japanese version and where some things were changed, which did encourage me to go back and watch certain episodes subbed as well. Season 4 is mostly about the kids getting ready for graduation and figuring out what they're going to do with their lives, and Chazz's episodes show him still aiming to live up to his family name. Which didn't make a ton of sense to me, because that conflict with his brothers was kind of all about Chazz deciding to forge his own path with his own values, and that wasn't something exaggerated by the dub. In both versions, the Princeton brothers' actions and dialogue are pretty consistent, and the overall lesson is basically the same. I know I've spent a lot of time on Chazz already, for a character I've said I was never that attached to, and I don't plan to do this for everyone. We would be here literally forever. But I just think he showcases a lot of points that I wanted to make about GX's characterization in general. There are so many characters who were built up well in the beginning, but then that potential isn't taken advantage of. We meet his brothers in episode 25, out of 180 for context, but I can't think of another episode after that duel where we ever see them again, which is disappointing because they should be important. To keep the comparison going, remember in original Yu-Gi-Oh! When Noah and Gozaburo were introduced? And sure, it was technically a filler arc and brought in at the worst possible time, but it didn't really feel that way because it was so important to understanding Kaiba's character and what made him the way he was. That's the effect Chazz's brothers should have had, but the pressure from his family just doesn't feel relevant any time after it's first introduced. Alexis was in a similar position. She stood out early on for being one of the top duelists in their class, and she had an interesting purpose, looking for her brother who went missing at the school. But as the series goes on, she fades into the background more than any other character. I'd say even more than Bastion, who's at least notable for having the running gag that everyone always overlooks him. He's literally left behind in another dimension at the end of the series, and no one seems all that concerned. I mean, she never did anything to really get on my nerves. She does develop a one-sided crush on Jaden, but it never completely takes over her character, which I appreciated. Mostly, the longer GX went on, the more it felt like Alexis was only around because the writers felt that they needed to have at least one female character in the main group, even if she served literally no other purpose. I will say she was another one they tried to add to at the very end, in a way that didn't quite fly with me. It started out well. A lot of shit went down in Season 3, and after spending so long in a place where every duel was a life or death situation, Jaden's lost his ability to have fun with dueling. Which was also something I appreciated seeing. Moments where the kids were actually affected by the horrific things they're experiencing, which isn't something you get a lot of in kids' shows. The school holds a tag team tournament as a goodbye present to the graduating class, and Jaden reclaims his love for dueling through working with Alexis, and simultaneously helps her make an important decision about her future plans. And in that episode, it felt like a really good moment for her. Maybe just enough to smooth over how little focus she'd gotten throughout the rest of the series. But then its significance is almost completely overwritten by the rest of Season 4, because Jaden learns basically that exact same lesson from his duel with Yugi at the very end of the series, and the last moment they give Alexis really hurt her character more than helped, I felt. The final villain gets his power from preying on people's doubts and insecurities. We see Jaden's friends stuck in this realm where they have to confront their greatest fears, and Alexis's scenes gave me pause. We see her back at Duel Academy, but as a teacher this time, struggling to motivate her students. And she goes on to worry that maybe she just doesn't have the generous spirit required of a teacher, which could have been an interesting conflict for her character. But I have to admit I was a little distracted by the fact that this is the first we've heard about any of this from her. Not that I don't think it could be a fitting aspiration for Alexis, but she's never even hinted at having a passion for teaching before this moment. And it's another thing I might have assumed was a dub discrepancy, except we were just in her head analyzing her plans for the future maybe 10 episodes earlier with the tag team duels, and she didn't express any desire to teach then either. As of, I don't know, a week or two earlier, her only plans were that she was going to stay on at Duel Academy to conduct some sort of research. I don't think they even specify what it was she wanted to study. The big decision she had to make was that she'd gotten an offer to study abroad and didn't know if she wanted to take it, and ultimately realizes through the tournament that all her friends are moving on with their lives, and she should too, that her hesitance was just a reluctance to leave her time here behind. Seriously, the tag team episodes were really good, for both of their characters, which is why it's so frustrating to me to see that development undermined later on. I just can't help feeling it was a last-ditch effort to add to her character because she'd been so neglected up to this point, and the writers regretted it at the last minute. Of everyone in the original little group, Cyrus was the only one who never really grew on me, which does feel like a bit of a shame because I can appreciate that he grows a lot near the end, and I think it's especially a shame because Cyrus may have had the most potential starting out. His insecurities and the way they tied into his relationship with his brother made him the most interesting character early on. Like, other than introducing the mystery with Alexis's brother, it's the first real serious development that anyone gets in this series, and was actually one of the first instances that made me think this series might be better than I'd thought. And ironically, I think where things start to go downhill for Cyrus is that he's one of the few characters who's not neglected. Cyrus has a ton of screen time compared to a lot of his friends, and I mean meaningful screen time. Several episodes devoted just to overcoming those insecurities. But once that episode's mini-plot is over, he continues on like nothing happened, trailing after Jaden, just being this all-around whiny ball of pessimism, and by the time he finally starts standing on his own near the end of Season 3, it was just too late for me. I'd already lost patience with him a long time ago. So Cyrus is one of those few characters in the odd position of being a character that I really want to like, but just don't. I do feel like they kind of dropped the ball with Cyrus also, and I've always suspected it might be because his main struggles are so tied into his relationship with his brother, and Zane's characterization is kind of all over the place. But I'm going to come back to him, because if there's any lesson to be learned from Zane, I think it ties into one of the major events that's later to come in the series. I'll try to keep the more minor characters brief, because we are only up to Season 2. Jaden and Cyrus did have a third roommate, Chumley, who I have a soft spot for because he had all the best dialogue early on, poking fun at things in a way that tended to test the fourth wall, if not actually break it. After he leaves, that's something that becomes characteristic of the dub in general, and I know that's one of the many reasons the dub isn't for everyone, but I had a lot of fun with it. In Season 2, he's replaced by Hasselberry, a new student who's technically a raw yellow, but becomes so impressed by Jaden after losing a duel to him that he invites himself to be their new roommate. Hasselberry is likable enough. He's goofy in his own way, speaking to everyone like they're all in his own personal military. Honestly, though, it kind of felt like they only brought him in so Cyrus would have someone to interact with who was more on his level, as Jaden goes on to meet more impressive duelists. Which brings us to Aster, who might just be my favorite character. Honestly, I feel like the plots for the first 2 seasons were kind of hit or miss for me. Like, they both did some interesting things, but I wasn't really drawn in by either one. Which is probably why, when I think of Season 2, Aster's character development tends to be the first thing that comes to mind, rather than the brainwashing cult storyline it was actually meant to revolve around. They're connected, of course. One is just far more impressive than the other. Aster Phoenix is this pro-duelist who's working with the guy taking over the school with his cult, but he's never presented as a villain. It's clear he's meant to be the new rival from his first introduction, and he's got a lot more going for him than Chazz ever did. He parallels Jaden in a lot of interesting ways. They both work with hero-themed decks, and it's clear that that's the way Aster views himself, as the hero, which had the potential to be super insufferable, but it's really not like that. He may be an arrogant, snarky little brat, but there's something grounded about Aster too. He's had to work to get to where he is, and he values justice and cares about doing the right thing above all else, so you know some sort of redemption story was in order as he starts off on the wrong side. But it happened a lot sooner than I was expecting. Aster starts distancing himself from Sartorius almost immediately when he starts to suspect that they may not have the same intentions, which is something I really respect in a character, when they can realize they might be wrong and take steps to fix that. But mostly, more than any other character, you know, aside from Jaden, who has the built-in advantage of being the main protagonist, Aster felt like he had his own story, and was one of the few who felt fully developed by the time the series ends. The Destiny Hero deck that he uses was actually created by his father, who was killed, or kidnapped in the dub, by someone who stole the last card. Aster's on a personal mission to find his father's killer and complete his deck, which he does, and he sticks around to help out in Season 3, under the guise of checking out a new student's deck, but personally, I suspect it's just because he knows trouble follows Jaden, and it's not at all a stretch to call him a vigilante. I will say, if there's one place he's suffered for not being the main character, it was with emotional follow-through. I mentioned earlier that I really appreciate it when characters are shown to be affected by the things they experience, especially in shows like this one where they're supposed to just be ordinary kids going to school, not training to fight the forces of evil or anything. They all struggle in Season 2, but Aster goes through his own personal hell. His father's soul is finally put to rest, but in the process he finds the card thief in the man who adopted and raised him in all the years since. And this is all happening while his closest friend, who's also a father or older brother figure of sorts, is losing his mind and brainwashing his new friends. I've never been able to find any reliable information on just how much older Sartorius is, but he and Aster met when they were both young, and bonded over being lonely orphans, Sartorius had this gift to see the future and basically told Aster he was destined for greatness. I don't know. Even when he had good intentions, the whole thing just felt manipulative to me. Given the way Aster grows up, it was basically exactly what he wanted to hear, and I'm sure Sartorius could see that. Though he technically ends the series as a good guy, Sartorius was another one I never warmed up to. Anyway, Aster moves on from all this with barely a moment to process. Not that we get to see, at least. And that disappointed me a little. Aster does continue to grow throughout Season 3. They kind of made a point to show that Aster didn't get close to people easily, so it's a big deal when he sacrifices himself for his friends while they're all stuck in another dimension. Honestly, the significance to that felt very blink and you miss it, and it's another thing we never get to see any sort of reaction to, but in general, compared to all these characters who were set up just to be forgotten about, they did a good job with Aster. Which brings us, finally, to Season 3. I know, we're like 20 minutes in and just now getting to the things that really moved me enough to want to write my thoughts down and make a video. This is where it might start sounding more like my regular reviews, because the character development in Season 3 is more directly related to what's going on in the story. Season 3 starts out by introducing us to 4 more characters. Bear with me here, I swear this is leading back to Jaden. These 4 are transfer students from the school's international branches, and they all have their roles to play in the story. Most notable is Jessie, who connects with Jaden immediately over their shared ability to see dual monster spirits, which does play into the story, but was never as big of a deal as I was kind of waiting for it to be. I mean, it's not limited to Jessie and Jaden. Chazz can see card spirits. Chumley could see his card spirits. Aster starts developing that ability after his duel with Jaden. Apparently it's just something some people can do. But it definitely felt like it defined Jessie more than anyone else. He tells Jaden very early on that he considers his crystal beasts to be his family, not just his friends. Honestly, I don't have as much to say about Jessie as I feel like I probably should. I really liked Jessie. He's very cheerful and positive and just a little awkward. He and Jaden are very similar, something that's pointed out repeatedly. It felt kind of like he got all of Jaden's good points without having the pressure of having to carry the whole show. Looking back critically, it actually doesn't feel like Jessie does all that much. Their friendship has a huge impact on Jaden, and he's always right there in the thick of things with him, but he kinda just feels like the most proactive sidekick. And then he spends the second half of the season either missing or possessed. Jessie did also have his own storyline of needing one more card to finish his deck, but it feels like less of a journey for him. That last card ends up in his possession almost coincidentally, as a natural side effect of the bigger story. He does come back in Season 4 to help Jaden out again, and I can hardly argue that he wasn't important. I do feel like something was missing with Jessie, but I'll admit that I can't really put my finger on what. I'm going to move on from the most likable newcomer to the least likable one, because that was the closest I could find to a natural way to introduce Adrian into the story. It might seem a little strange, because he does tend to be right there in the middle of everything too, but it really felt like Adrian had his own separate story that just happened to coincide with what our heroes were doing. He's introduced right off the bat as this smarmy, analytical jerk who clearly can't be trusted, but I kind of wanted to like Adrian. A part of me suspected he would eventually become one of the good guys, but he was also just a very interesting character to me. I liked the dynamic he brought to the story early on, also working against the main villain, though on his own and for his own reasons. He may not have been doing it with the intention of helping them, but our heroes would have had a much tougher time without Adrian's interference. Adrian is the heir to a very powerful family. Or he was supposed to be. He was adopted by a couple who thought they couldn't have children, only to find themselves pregnant soon after. But this wasn't really as cut and dry as it was kind of presented to be later on. Adrian is clearly ambitious, but the show also goes out of its way in one episode to show that he does love his younger brother. He really doesn't seem that personally scorned by having his position in the family usurped by their biological son. Given that he comes from literally nothing, I don't think it's much of a stretch to say there's still a humble side to him that appreciates just being part of a family, and we're never given the impression that they love him any less since their younger son's birth. Adrian's character is meant to be mysterious. His personal goals are intentionally kind of vague, so I think there's a lot of room for interpretation there, and the way I viewed his character left me pretty disappointed with the road the series took him down. And left him on. Adrian was the other character just left indefinitely in another dimension at the end of GX. He had this childhood friend who was personally offended by the injustice he faced within the family politics. So when they all find themselves stuck in another dimension, she sees it as the perfect opportunity for Adrian to take over and be the king he was meant to be. But this doesn't seem like something Adrian really wants himself until he acquires Exodia, which clearly has some sort of dark influence over him. This might be another dub thing. I've not done much extra research into Adrian's character, but I have heard the dub really downplayed the jealousy he felt towards his brother, which I know influenced the way I saw things. But I was disappointed with the way things ended with Adrian. It felt oversimplified, I guess, and I do think that's at least partially because he never blended into the main story as well as he could have. Like he was this outside force from start to finish. Which leaves us with Jim and Axel, who were both interesting from the get-go, but really start pulling their weight when things start to go downhill. Jim was pretty simple, designed to be so stereotypically Australian that even the 4Kids dub couldn't overwrite it, right down to the crocodile friend he carries around with him. He was another one who was just cheerful and positive and all-around likable. Axel was a little more complicated. He's introduced as the protege of the man who's pretty obviously going to be the main villain, for the first half of the season anyway, but there's nothing to suggest he's got any really serious ties to Viper, not the kind that tend to override common sense, and he's another one who's passionate about justice and doing the right thing. So, like with Aster, I wasn't surprised when he didn't stay on the wrong side for long. Season 3 was where things started to get really dark, and the danger felt the most real. It was no longer some vague threat to be confronted in between classes. We're talking the entire school being transported to another dimension, and the kids having to worry about having enough food or medicine for the injured. Axel grew up in the wilderness. Not in, total isolation, he's shown to be very close to both of his parents, but in an environment that really stressed honing his survival skills, so he really shined in situations like these, when the others needed someone who actually knew what they were talking about to take charge. Which finally brings us back to Jaden. Up until this point, even as things were starting to get more serious, Jaden has been pretty comfortably playing his role as main protagonist, facing the bad guys with a smile, some cheesy one-liners, and the ingrained optimism that no matter how bad things look, they'd all make it out okay. Which just goes to show that he was not prepared for Season 3 either. The whole school ending up in another dimension is just the first half of Season 3. They manage to return home, but Jesse has to stay behind to keep the portal open. Thus begins Jaden's downward spiral when they get home and realize they've left him behind. Jaden manages to open the portal back up, and is met there by his other friends, who let him know that of course they're not going to let him go alone. And don't get me wrong, Jaden's loss of control as he slowly succumbs to guilt was also really interesting to me, but it was around this point that it really hit me just how many characters were in this show. I'm sure it's not something I need to point out. We've probably hit the half-hour mark by now, and not much of that time has actually been spent on our main protagonist. But there's a scene in one of the episodes around this point where Jaden's friends are all looking for him, and I just had to pause the episode and count how many people were on screen. And there were like 9 of them, and I don't think that even made up the whole group at this point. And that alone kinda blew me away. That's a huge group to build around your main character, even for someone like Jaden, who's meant to be one of those characters people are just drawn to. And at the time, it just stood out to me in a neat, fun fact sort of way. And then, what felt like only a few episodes later, we're suddenly given the start of this dark, sad backstory for Jaden Yuki of all people. We learn that his parents never really had time for him as a kid, so he spent his free time playing Duel Monsters with the neighborhood kids, literally anyone who had time for him. But one of his card spirits was rather protective of him, and the kids he played against tended to suffer mysterious injuries, which doesn't generally make too many people want to spend time with you. So, long story short, as a child, Jaden was always alone, and even with the dark turn things have taken, you just have to know that his time at Duel Academy, going on all these crazy adventures with a huge group of friends, has got to be everything he's ever wanted. It was a really poignant realization for me, that then came back and hit me like a truck when it all started falling apart around him. Jaden's character in Season 3 was just one thing after another for me, in a good way. The first dip into his backstory is really just the beginning. It sets up the plot side of it. That same card spirit, Yubel, which he, let's say, distanced himself from when he realized what was going on, is the one taking over now, and has possessed Jessie to do so. Of course, Jaden doesn't know this at first. Jessie is just missing, and he's recklessly chasing any lead there is to find him, neglecting all of his other friends in the process. It really doesn't sink in for him until he loses 4 of them in one duel, and that realization doesn't exactly bring him to his senses the way they'd hoped. I want to take a moment to just say, I know the whole part where the villains are threatening to send their souls to the stars is absolutely a dub thing. He definitely thought his friends were dead in the original, but they find out later on that they were really just locked away in another dimension, so I just find it a little funny that technically the dub's sanitized version was kind of right. Anyway, Jaden was already losing the battle with his guilt at this point. Now it literally consumes him, and this darker side of him takes over. This is where Axel and Jim start to really shine, as 2 of the few to make it out of this first big conflict. I mean, they already stood out. There's something to be said for loyalty, but all the new characters in Season 3 definitely felt more useful than his early group of friends. The next leg of this journey, where Jim and Axel band together to rescue their friend from his own negativity, is one of those things that I almost feel you can do a disservice to by picking it apart too much. I mean, one of the reasons I really liked it, as I was trying to get at before, is because they felt competent. Any of Jaden's friends would have had plot armor on their side, but I would trust these 2 to actually accomplish something, and even for them it doesn't go perfectly. Jim gets his own hidden mystical power moment, and I was already really fond of him, and I really liked Axel's storyline. He's the one who was always prepared for everything, and now has to deal with being really shaken by everything that's happened before he can go back and pick up where Jim left off. I just thought it was really cool to see someone other than the main character save the day. There would not have been any sort of happy ending without Jim and Axel. It just felt like really good storytelling. Honestly, Season 3 is worth watching even if you skip the rest. And even after this, Jaden's journey isn't complete yet. He's brought back to his senses, losing Jim and Axel in the process, which hasn't done much for his confidence. Aster and Zane have been off fighting this world in their own way up until this point, and Cyrus was off finally learning to stand on his own, and they all come back at this point to support Jaden in their own ways. And I know I've loved every step of Season 3, particularly because I never expected Jaden to get any sort of real serious character development, but the last step was one I was particularly fond of. After all this struggle to save Jaden from his darkness, he then has to accept it as a part of himself if he's going to have any hope of defeating Yubel. And I know it's hardly unique to GX, but that's just one of my favorite storytelling ideas in general, where the hero has to accept his flaws or darkness rather than overcome them completely. And it's not an isolated incident here. I said I would come back to Zane, and also that his character was a little scattered. He starts out as the top student in the school, really harsh and critical in some ways, but not always. He actually comes across as being pretty neutral and polite, except in situations involving his brother, who he's really hard on. Like, to the point where you can't even really consider it tough love anymore, it's just hurting him. But they make pretty good progress towards reconnecting in Season 1. That's then overwritten by Season 2, kind of brought back in Season 3, and mostly resolved in Season 4. But in Zane's case, his relationship with his brother felt like the less important half of his character development. He graduates at the end of Season 1 and moves on to the Pro League, where he loses a duel to Aster and falls from grace in Season 2. Thus begins his descent into darkness, and what I thought was madness at the time. At the end of it all, Zane's character feels like another one where a lot is left up to interpretation, and the lesson that I got out of it wasn't the one I was initially expecting. Alexis's brother, who I also mostly skipped over, kind of parallels this and ties into Zane's story. He was also stuck in another dimension, back in Season 1, and had to let his own darkness take over just to survive. Atticus starts out with the more typical storyline I was expecting. They rescue him from that darkness and defeat the big evil so he can move on, and Atticus is another of my favorites because he was not at all what I was expecting afterwards. He gets a few angsty recovery moments, but for the most part he's just this fun, upbeat goofball. But when Zane returns to the school looking a little unhinged, Atticus and Cyrus both try to rescue him from that dark influence. And neither succeed. And maybe I didn't have that much faith in Cyrus, but for Atticus it's a big moment. He's convinced his old friend is going through the same thing he was, and is willing to use his own darkness again to try and get through to him on that level. And I was shocked when it didn't work, or at least leave Zane with enough doubt to change himself moving forward. He mellows out a little as we move into Season 3, but as more time passed without Zane getting some sort of big redemption moment where he regrets his past actions, the more I started to consider that maybe I'd just read his character wrong. I mean, I can't say the changes were all bad. Not after his early adjustment period, anyway. Zane was one of those characters who was always in control, almost obsessively so, I'd say, and he's certainly loosened up a little. He's not on some quest for revenge. We're never given any indication that he holds a grudge against Aster. There's a touching scene about halfway through Season 4 where he hands down his old deck to Cyrus. He talks about how he hit a wall because he didn't feel like he had any more room to grow, but now he's going to start over. And honestly, that felt like a scene that did more for Cyrus's character development than Zane's, but it at least reaffirmed that everything Zane did, he did for self-improvement. And there are some very real-life lessons to be found in that. Sometimes self-improvement doesn't always look the way you'd expect or want it to, but that doesn't necessarily make it a bad change. This lesson felt reinforced, one, by the way Jaden's character has grown and changed by this point, but also in the way Atticus continued to grow. At the point where he uses his Night Shroud persona to duel Zane, it's not really a positive moment for him. He's still not really in control, but I'd like to think that experience set him down the right path, got him thinking that maybe it's not something that needs to be feared, and when he embraces that darkness again in Season 4 to save another friend, it finally feels like he's come full circle. Progress that's immediately overwritten by some genuinely frustrating plot armor bullshit because, Jaden has to be the one to defeat the final villain in the end. But in general, Atticus was one of the few characters who felt complete by the end, and his story was one of a few instances of GX trying to share a bigger lesson, that light and darkness, or goodness and evil, aren't as simple as most other kids' shows often portray them to be, which is something I love to see addressed with younger audiences. There's actually more that could be said about Jaden and his connection with Belle, the way they fuse at the end and how that affects him, but honestly it was never addressed as thoroughly as I wanted it to be. I felt like Jaden's most meaningful development in Season 4 happened with his tag team duel with Alexis, and I've already covered that. Sometimes there's a bigger message I'm trying to share, and sometimes this channel is literally just a dumping ground for my thoughts. I'd like to think this was somewhere in the middle. I'm not trying to argue that GX was actually fantastic. It got really good for at least the second half of Season 3, but Season 4 and I have our differences, and it was really hard for me to get into, story-wise, for the first 100 episodes or so. But I can say that a lot of the things it did with its characters really moved me, and it might be worth checking out, or reacquainting yourself with, if you skipped over it like I did. Thank you for watching.